And joining me to discuss President Biden's Oval Office address is Republican presidential candidate, Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina. Senator Scott, appreciate you joining us here. So President Biden, as you know, today he asked for $100 billion for Israel, for Ukraine, for the border, and for Taiwan. Would you support that legislation of $100 billion? Well,
thank you for the question. I certainly say I was frustrated by this speech. Terrorists bombed our ally Israel, and we heard more about Ukraine than we did our ally Israel. And the package itself has more money for Ukraine than it does for Israel. I think we would be better off having a single focus on Israel, giving them the resources they need to win this war, and then move on to other topics.
So do you disagree with the way that he connected these conflicts? He said that turning your back on Ukraine and on Israel is just not worth it. He says it's an investment in keeping U.S. troops out of future conflicts. Do you disagree?
I think we should definitely keep our troops at home. We can do that by making sure that our allies have the resources that they need. The one thing we know without question, with great certainty, is that Israel is in the beginning of a war. They need our single-minded focus on their conflict, and then we can pivot back to Ukraine. We can do both at the same time, by the way, but it will first start with having the resources in the hands of Israel.
Some have said that Putin would actually love that if Congress decided that we can't deal with Ukraine right now, we've got to focus on Israel. Taking our eye off the ball in Ukraine might be just exactly what Vladimir Putin wants.
I think we can walk and chew gum. We've got $100 billion invested.
I think that's what President Biden's asking.
We have $100 billion we have $100 billion in Ukraine. We have provided so far nothing to Israel other than our annual appropriations. If we want to focus on being successful in Israel, we need to focus on two things. Number one, making sure Israel has all the resources that they need. And number two, making sure that Iran pays a very high price for the challenges that they've brought into the Middle East, to include freezing the $6 billion that President Biden gave to Iran that helps support and fund terrorism. He said it himself for the first time so far since the conflict started. He said, Iran funds terrorism. Hamas says, thank you for the money. Freezing those assets should have happened before. Actually, he should never have given the assets.
Well, just to be clear, that money has not been spent, and it's not money that's directly going to
money
Iran.
Is
I understand the point you're making. I'm just
perhaps we don't, because
just as a factual matter, so our audience understands, the money has not been spent.
Let me speak to your audience. The bottom line is simply this: that your president gave $6 billion to pay for hostages. He gave it to the #1 state sponsor of terrorism. As a result of that, $6 billion, the price on every American head went high, and there's a price to be paid for that.
Just to circle back to,
I want to make sure that we get this point right, because I am not misleading your audience. So let's make sure they understand.
I just want to.
$6 billion is really a high price that causes more terrorism.
I just want to clarify the question that I asked initially, which is, if $100 billion for all those priorities that the president listed came to the floor of the Senate, would you vote in support of it?
Well, it certainly matters how it's broken down, but number one,
if it's a package for all of those things, would you vote in support of it?
The details matter. So let me give you the breakdown of the details as we understand them. $60 billion for Ukraine and only $10 billion for Israel means that the president does not have his eye on the ball.
Let's leave it there for now. I want to ask you about $100 million that is aid that is being sent to Gaza. You've said recently that you oppose that.
Yes.
But I wonder, just putting aside some of the kind of political rhetoric around this,
absolutely,
how is making life more miserable for Gazans something that helps Israel?
I'm glad you asked that question. Let's take a look at how this thing started on October the 7th. We saw babies decapitated. We saw babies burned. We saw women raped. We saw grandmothers taken. And Israel's response is to make sure that never happens again. To provide complete and total support for Israel means giving them the resources and the flexibility they need to
I understand, but I'm talking about humanitarian aid, which Israel, by the way, has agreed to.
The way you get there the fastest is making sure that every single support system that needs to be in place is there. And number two, I don't want a dime, a nickel, a penny ending up in the hands of Hamas. We know that at the end of the day, in the Gaza Strip, Hamas controls every penny.
This is not, what I'm talking about here and what this aid is not cash. We're talking about access to water,
who's driving the trucks?
Food, medical care.
Who's driving them in?
I guess what I'm saying, Senator, is if Israel has agreed with the United States to allow $100 million of humanitarian aid into southern Gaza, where they have asked for civilians to go to, why would you oppose that aid being provided?
Well, number one, I believe that making sure that every penny that America spends anywhere does not end up in the hands of terrorist organizations is my responsibility.
One of the other issues here is about the Americans who are in Gaza.
Yes.
And presumptively, some of this aid would benefit them, too. There are probably about 500 to 600 of them there. Do you think that they ought to be fending for themselves?
Well, I'll just say what I've said earlier, not on this show. Israel has provided those residents living in Gaza an opportunity to leave the vulnerable areas. And as a result of that...
And that's where this aid is going, by the way.
As a result of that, they find themselves in a position to get out of harm's way. By doing that, we accelerate the path to victory for Israel, which then eliminates the need for a conflict.
One of the things that you've done today is introduced a piece of legislation that would pull back federal student aid for schools that, in your view, facilitate or promote events with an anti-Semitic message. You say that this hits them where it hurts, their pocketbooks.
Yes.
But I wonder, I mean, there are a lot of students who are beneficiaries of federal student aid who have nothing to do with these pro-Palestinian protests. Wouldn't this just hurt them?
Well, let's take a look back. In 2017, I introduced legislation for the definition of anti-Semitism to be codified on college campuses in the same way that we use it in state departments. What we've seen on college campuses since October 7th is kids protesting, that's their constitutional right, asking for genocide of Jews, murdering of Jews, supporting terrorism. For those universities and colleges that do nothing to stamp out that kind of racism, discrimination, and, frankly, the support of genocide, that is a problem with American tax dollars.
But, again, doesn't that just penalize people who may have had absolutely nothing to do with it? That's a very small minority of anybody who's on these college campuses. And beyond that, people have raised questions about, you've described it a certain way.
Well, actually, it's the way that it is. Just take a look at the videos.
I'm just going to, it's fine how you've described it. That's your view of it.
Yes, ma'am.
Some of the protesters would say that we might be penalized simply for advocating for Palestinians. Doesn't this risk infringing on their freedom of speech?
No, actually, the first thing I said was their freedom of speech is protected. You do not have the freedom to encourage genocide. You don't have the freedom to say, let's murder people in our country. You don't have the freedom to say, we're going to support terrorism, and frankly, supporting terrorism means supporting the death of Americans and others. I think with my tax dollars, that is a part of the federal spending, if the colleges and universities are not willing to push back on hate on their college campuses, not the expression of disagreements, but saying, let's murder people, that leadership should be punished.
Leadership should be punished, but I think you would agree that students would be as well.
Let us be clear here. The universities are responsible for the actions on their campuses. The president himself said, we should root out hate, but he didn't talk about the squad. He didn't talk about the universities where we find the hate being fomented.
I want to ask you about your presidential campaign. We're in the middle of this cycle. Just today, the New York Times is reporting that your super PAC is pulling millions of dollars in ads this fall. And according to a memo obtained by the Times, the chairman of the super PAC wrote to its donors saying, we aren't going to waste our money when the electorate isn't focused or ready for a Trump alternative. Do you agree that the electorate isn't ready for a Trump alternative?
Well, I don't run the super PAC, so I can't tell you exactly what that memo meant, but what I can tell you that it focuses on is reserving our resources until later in the campaign so that as we get close to the January 15th date of the Iowa caucus, we have the resources to spend effectively. In this current news cycle, breaking through this current news cycle seems to be impossible. So any alternative to the former president will not have actual opportunity to showcase why they should be the alternative.
And there's a presidential debate coming up. Will you be on the debate stage?
I will be on the debate stage.
You've met the requirements?
Indeed.
If your campaign doesn't gain more momentum in the coming weeks, would you consider dropping out?
Oh, of course not. We believe that America is ready for an optimistic, positive messenger who is anchored in consistently conservative values.
I want to ask you about one more thing. This is an audio message that was received by the wife of one of your colleagues in the House as a result of all of this rancor over the House Speaker vote. I'm going to play it for you.
Warmongering piece of shit. So listen, you're going to keep getting calls and emails. I'm putting all your information over the internet now. Everybody else is. And you will not be left alone because your husband, Jim Jordan, or more conservative, or you're going to be molested like you can't ever imagine. And again, non-violently.
What do you make of that?
Well, unfortunately, that's disgusting and reprehensible and unfortunately consistent with dozens of messages that I get on a consistent basis. I will say that public officials and their spouses and their families are greater targets than we've ever been. It's not only unfortunate, it's criminal.
Senator Tim Scott, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate you giving us some time today.
Yes, ma'am. Good to be with you.
Thank you.
Absolutely.